I've done a lot of things from science to art. I'm not going to talk as much about my artwork today as I'm going to talk about some of the people who I've interacted with and photographed during the projects I've worked on. Before we get started, I kind of wrote this talk around the idea of compassion, and I want to show a little bit of compassion to everybody who comes to these Creative Morning events first. Okay, so, we all love Creative Mornings. We come here and we get a coffee and we get a taco and we're happy, right? And then this thing happens, like somebody comes up and wants to meet you. And you're like, oh, bummer. My hands are full of coffee and taco. Even worse, they're from Austin and you have to hug them, right? So this is a big problem. What do? You can balance your taco on top of your coffee. You can put it in your mouth. You can put it on your head, but like none of these things are really satisfying. Meanwhile, the other person's like, what's wrong with this guy? They have empathy, but do they have compassion? I have compassion because I've come up with a solution for you for next time. Since we live in Texas, we should have a taco holster, right? I don't like guns, but I can carry my taco in a holster. So next time we have this, I'll make a Kickstarter. We'll have these taco holsters for Creative Mornings. So my life has kind of revolved around the idea of searching for and seeking out the creativity, trying to find it in myself, looking for it in other places, being envious of people who I think have amazing creativity, and just it's wrapped itself around my life. And in that search for creativity and to try and use creativity, my life keeps circling back to these ideas of empathy and understanding and compassion. When I talked to Ben about the talks, the themes that were going to be available for this year, the theme of compassion just really stood out to me. And I hadn't actually thought too much about how much that's been wrapped around my work until I thought about making a talk for this. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background of my life here and tell you where I'm coming from before I get into my work. So I've had a kind of weird and diverse life. That's a picture of me in high school. I'm the strange-looking guy, the tall one. Shortly after high school, I went to college in a dual degree program in physics and fine arts. Now, a lot of people might think that's strange because people often think that science and art are kind of opposite. But actually, I don't think they are. I think they're both ways to try and understand the world. Science is the way that we try and understand how the physical world works, whereas art is the way that we try and understand our place in the world. And I've been on both sides of that. So after spending a bit of time in studying physics and art, I actually dropped out of school. I ran out of money, dropped out of school, spent a little bit of time climbing, and then came back into school to study architecture. And while I was studying architecture, I got the opportunity to live in Japan. And so I lived in Japan for 3 years, where I studied Japanese arts and culture and language. And that was just a greatly eye-opening experience because I'd never really been out of the country before. So that started to expose me to really dramatically different ideas than what I was brought up with. After I finished up my undergraduate, I still felt the need to explore, and I went back into the sciences largely because I really wanted to explore. And I spent a lot of time in the rainforest chasing frogs. And it's fun. That's a picture of me. And then I helped start up a research institute at the University of Texas, and I co-ran that for 6 or 7 years. And during that time, I realized that I really needed to get back to the arts. So I was kind of plotting my exit from the sciences and trying to figure out a way to get back into art full time. And the way I decided to do this was to take advantage of my experience in both those things. So I'd gotten into photography while I was in the sciences, and I developed this project called Roadless, which was a conservation-based photography project to try and document some of these lands called inventoried roadless lands around the country. There's 60 million acres of these, and there's one person with a camera. It was kind of a crazy, gigantic project. To begin with, the thing that made it really crazy was that there was no maps of these places, which sounds insane, and it was insane. The Forest Service had GIS data, but there was no maps. And I was leaving academia, so I didn't have access to GIS, so I built this mapping program to map those. And at the time, that was kind of a big deal. and it was functional for many, many years. And then I started traveling to some of these places. This gave me the opportunity to really see a lot of our country that most people never see. These are lands that are not very well known. They're wilderness areas that a lot of people don't go to, and they're amazing. It was an incredible opportunity. It's very difficult to get to a lot of these places. Rather than talking about these places, what I actually want to talk to you about are many of the people that I met. As a part of this project, I wanted to meet people who supported the conservation of these places because I was also advocating for these lands in DC at the same time I was doing this. So I was going back and forth between these wilderness areas in the US to DC to Texas. This is one guy that I met, and he was a ranch manager in Montana. His name's Pat McKenna. And he told me this amazing story while I was sitting in his cabin on this ranch in Centennial Valley about how he grew up logging. He started logging in high school and became a logger in Northern California, logging redwoods. And one day after he'd felled a big tree and he was walking the length of it, taking off the limbs, he came across a flying squirrel nest. And all of the squirrels had been killed when the tree fell, which is not surprising. And he kind of looked at it, went on with his business. But he told me that that image never left him. And so for a month or two after that, he just kept thinking of that, and he had dreams about that, and he started to think about what he was doing for his livelihood. And within a month, he quit logging and moved to Montana to get into ranch work. And then he became a really strong conservationist and has advocated for the protection of the forest in those mountains behind the ranch. He's an amazing man. This beautiful place is America's rainforest in the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. It is an unbelievably lush and incredibly beautiful place. It is worth going to if you ever have time to get up there. This woman, Wanda, is from the Tlingit tribe in Southeast Alaska, and she's an artist and environmental activist. She's been an activist for decades. She has striven to protect these places from logging because they have really wonderful timber. And unfortunately, the person who's in charge largely of logging this area that she's been trying to protect was her brother, who was president of the Southeast Alaska Native Corporation that makes logging contracts for these lands, for the native lands. So for decades, she fought tooth and nail with her brother in court until her brother came down with a life-threatening kidney disease, and she donated a kidney to him. It's an amazing act of compassion. Eventually, I showed the photographs of these people and these places in the Senate building in DC. And that was good. I felt like I actually made a difference in the protection of these lands. And then, like happens in life, you have something really good, and then often something really challenging happens to you. And what happened to me was just some personal challenges with my personal life. And I was in a very dark place shortly after finishing this project. And I went and did an artist residency in Montana. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my art from that point, because I just really moved back into the arts. And it is a very big struggle being an artist, as many of you people probably know. And I came up with this idea of life as a canvas for art. The idea came from a friend of mine who's one of my best friends from high school, who's also a professional artist. He had said to me, well, your life itself is kind of a piece of art. You've done so many different strange things. And I decided to actually take that to heart and work with that idea to make an art piece out of an action in life. And I came up with this idea that I called the Enemies Project. And what this was I decided I wanted to travel to conflict zones around the world and bring people together from the opposite sides of conflicts. And I had just come out of a real severe personal conflict in my life, and I think I needed to understand how other people recovered from conflicts that were much more serious. And I raised some money through a Kickstarter and through some private funds, and I traveled to a number of conflict zones, former, current, and past conflict zones in Africa and South Asia. This is one of my favorite pictures of myself, largely because I've had a lot of extremely uncomfortable experiences with guns, and this is the one that actually was not uncomfortable at all. These guys were a blast. I'm just going to quickly run through a few of the people that I met there. that come to this idea of compassion and forgiveness, which to me is another form of compassion. This couple is a couple from the border of South Sudan and Sudan. The man is Dinka and the woman is Missouriya. There are two different tribes that sort of straddle that border, and they've been in conflict for centuries, literally. They found each other during the civil war in Sudan and became a couple. It's kind of this beautiful Romeo and Juliet type story. These two women from Kashmir are Ayesha and Ezebir. Ezebir is a good friend of mine. Ayesha is Hindu, Ezebir is Muslim. The major problem in Kashmir, which is on the border of India and Pakistan, tends to center around the Hindu-Muslim religious divide. And these two women are wonderful friends, and they're just one of many people who are friends, but most people are afraid to be photographed like this because it is actually dangerous to show that type of friendship in public. These were the first two people that I photographed in the Enemies Project. This is from the Kibera slums of Nairobi in Kenya. That man and woman, they're not married, they're actually just neighbors, and there's kids behind them. And they come from two different tribes who had a very severe violent ethnic conflict after a failed election in 2007 in Kenya. Many, many people were killed, and many people lost their homes, including that woman. And actually, he lost his business as well. And yet, they were able to become friends. And they met through me. I brought them together to photograph them together. Not all these stories are positive. When I was traveling and meeting people, you hear a lot of incredibly painful stories, and some of them have been resolved, and some of them haven't, and some may never be resolved. And this story is one of those ones that may never be resolved. This woman is from Kashmir, and she's what's known as a half-widow. Half-widows are women in Kashmir whose husbands have been abducted by the Indian security. And that was during a time when there was really severe conflict in Kashmir. And a lot of Kashmiri men were abducted, and they never returned. Nobody knows what happened to them. They're probably not alive, but the women don't know. And because they don't know what has happened to their husband, they cannot be considered widows, which is a very challenging thing for a Muslim society, because they don't have a husband, they're not widows, they're in a really tight spot. And it is very hard for them to work within society and to make a living. So this is one of the half-widows I photographed in Kashmir, and their stories are heartrending. And then on the other side, you see some stories that are just heart-opening. This is a good friend of mine, Ben Ochieng. He's also from the slums of Nairobi, Kenya. And Ben also experienced that same violent insurrection that happened after the 2007 elections. And one of the things that happened was so many people were killed that there was a lot of orphans at the time. And Ben and his wife adopted almost 20 kids, which is crazy. Right? I mean, I now have a stepdaughter, and I cannot imagine having 19 more. And they live in the slums, right? They don't have any money at all. And so on top of this, Ben also started a school because there were so many orphans and kids who needed schooling, and there was no schools in the slums. And most of the kids do not have enough money to go outside of the slums to a government school. And this is a picture of his school. And then on top of this, he also started a youth group to get kids off the street and a craft co-op to make a way for people to make crafts to sell to tourists. And just this last year, he opened a clinic. He's amazing. And he's just this guy who lives in the slums. He has no resources on his own. I've helped him raise money several times. But he's just done it by meeting people and reaching out and keeping up those connections. He's on Facebook, and he messages me. He messaged me yesterday to see how things are going. I told him I was going to talk about him. There are these amazing people out there. And one thing that I found in my talk was the vast breadth of stories that are out in the world is a bit hard to comprehend. And it runs the gamut from those really sad stories to the really wonderful stories, but there are more wonderful stories out there than you can imagine. And that totally changed my life. And this is one that I really need to finish with from the Enemies Project. So this woman I met in Rwanda, whose name is not Janet, actually. She didn't want her name used because there's some laws in Rwanda about talking about racial issues, tribal issues. So Rwanda, as everyone probably knows, had a really horrible genocide in the 90s. There's two tribal groups there, and one was committing genocide on the other. And after the genocide, many, many people went to jail for their part, for taking part in the genocide, killing people, burning homes, whatever. And it was a lot of men who went to jail. And they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Part of what came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was this deal that people could get out of jail after a couple of years if they went to the community where they had committed their crimes and asked for forgiveness from the people against who they had committed crimes. So this woman, her entire family was murdered. Everyone. Her parents, all of her siblings, her aunts and uncles. And one of the men who was responsible for that came to ask her for forgiveness, and she forgave him. When she told me that, it was hard to understand. I cannot imagine being in that position. And I asked her, how can you do that? And this was her response. How else could I go on living? It's amazing. And I think that brought me to this idea. Compassion for somebody else is really another form of compassion for yourself. Because what she was saying was that living with all of that hatred inside you is not a life worth living. And by forgiving him, she was having sort of the ultimate compassion, not only for him, but for herself. These were the types of things that I listened to, and they really brought me out of the dark place I had been in my life, because my problems were minuscule. I mean, nothing compared to these people's, and it made all the difference to hear their stories. Compassion is part of something that we're all looking for. It's another form of connection. We spend our lives looking for connection with other people, trying to find it in one way or another. And that's, I think, been a big part of why I've done what I've done. I love community, I love my friends, I love people, and I love making those connections. And this project that I worked on, the Enemies Project, and the Roadless Project, were largely about that, about making connections for me. Which brings us back to Creative Mornings. Right? This is all about making connections. And one of the things, I don't know if you could see it on that last slide, the animation with the little person sitting under the stars. When I went back into being an artist, I really struggled with being an artist who was coming back after a career in the sciences. Even though I had been an artist before that, I felt totally out of place. And it was very hard for me to feel myself as an artist in that space. And finding connections to people and building a community, I found extremely challenging. And I found that things like Creative Morning actually were, and some other groups I've been a part of, were the perfect thing for that. And that actually leads me to the next overwhelmingly large project that I'm working on, which is this thing that I'm calling Unbound. It's about this idea of bringing people together, and it's all around the idea of bringing people together around the topic of creativity. Not just creativity in the arts, where we normally think of it, but even the idea of creativity as a way to find solutions to social problems. Creativity is a way to find ways to bring people together. Creativity is a very broad word. So I'm starting this thing that's called Unbound. And it is going to be a community to bring together people to do creative work, and a magazine that focuses on the creative process in sort of all different fields. I've been a part of all of these events now, because I've been a part of Creative Mornings, and it's really wonderful to be up here. Thank you so much. And Pachacucha and TEDx are things that probably a lot of you have heard about. These are also similar communities that bring people together doing creative work from a lot of different fields. And so the idea of Unbound is to take what we normally do, which is we make these connections to other people in other fields and our own field, and find a way to accelerate that. And then to create a platform where that dives deep into creative communities at a local level and then brings those paths out. So people who are doing amazing work at a local level can be found, nationally or internationally. And the thing is, you come to these events and you see people doing incredible stuff. I mean, every time I go to a Creative Mornings or a Pechakucha or a TEDx, I see these people who are in our community who I've never heard of before. And I always think, how can I not have heard of this person? They're doing such incredible work. So the idea is to try and facilitate that so that more people can learn about the wonderful people in our community that are doing amazing stuff. And then the bigger picture is the idea of using creativity as a way to make the world a better place, which is also, to me, a giant connection I feel with Creative Mornings. Right now, I actually have a very kind of minimal beta site open for Unbound. And if any of you are creators and would like to get in kind of as a beta tester to help me figure out what it's going to look like, I want this to be a community effort to see what it should look like. And please join me. And that is it. Thank you so much, Creative Mornings.